Okay, hey, welcome back to The Last Question, Season 3, Episode 3. I'm really excited today. By the time you hear this episode, it should be third week of April in 2026. If you listen to the last episode, I teased it briefly. I'm talking to an old friend, old teacher of mine, a previous teacher of mine, maybe not an old teacher of mine. Matthew Estes, professor and department co-chair of history at Palomar College or Community College?
Palomar Community College, yeah.
Palomar Community College. Um, Been a historian and history teacher and professor for a long time. I encountered him in high school in the Deep South in Alabama, of all places. But today we're going to talk about, I'm really excited to talk to him. But the subject perhaps is not the most exciting, but I think it's probably one of the most important we can talk about, and it's certainly relevant to current events. And that is the internment or the incarceration of Japanese Americans in the World War II period. Matt is an expert on the subject for reasons that we'll get into, that you'll learn about, I think, over the course of this conversation. And yeah, Matt, super grateful that you agreed to do this, and I'm excited.
Yeah, thanks, Arun, and it's good to reconnect, man. So for those of you who aren't are familiar with our relationship, he was not only my student. We did a lot of camping in high school together, and did some big trips. So yeah, we go back.
Yeah, and nobody camps like this dude. Like, we tent camped, but I never even knew what a camp stove was until this guy pulled out like Michelin star level cooking utensils in a camp pavilion, and I was like, I didn't know you could even do, like, I figured we were eating dried food out of a Ziploc, but no, that's not how this is going to go. So yeah, that was a great time. So I mean, I'm so for listeners and viewers, I'm talking to Matt not only because he's an expert in the field, but because um, I think he knows how to talk about these subjects in a way that the traditional academic historian may not. Um, and so, and I think that's important for folks to understand why the subject matters. So, to start with, um, Matt, maybe give us a brief intro to you, who you are, your personal background, and I know we talked a good bit about it yesterday, but how you ended up studying the internment or the incarceration of the Japanese Americans in World War II, how you got into it, and perhaps why you continue to study it and work on it today.
Well, thanks, Arun. So, part of the reason I'm involved in this is my mother's family was incarcerated at Manzanar. Um, in the spirit of full disclosure, my mom and her immediate family were not sent to one of the camps, and we can talk about the details later, but they were evacuated like everybody else was. They were forced to get off the West Coast. And my mom, my grandmother, grandfather, and then a couple of her cousins spent most of the war in Denver, Colorado. But the rest of her extended family was interned at the concentration camp at Manzanar in California's Owen Valley and spent most of the war there. So, I've got a family connection to it. And then my father, who was Caucasian, pale with a red beard, no less. He grew up in the neighborhood low rent district of San Diego, where the Japanese Americans were living after the war because they had lost everything, and my grandmother was a single mom and working two jobs, and here are these two kids, my dad and my uncle, who basically were left to their own devices because their mom was working all the time. So the Japanese, being the community-minded folks they are, they kind of took them both in, and my father really really took to it. And so again, my red-bearded, pale father spoke fluent Japanese. He became a community college professor himself after some time in the army, and he became a researcher of the community experience a couple of decades before that sort of thing became fashionable in academia. And so he did a lot of research on the first generation of Japanese American immigrants, what we call the Issei. And growing up, I was very close to my father. We spent a lot of time together. And one of my earliest memories was working with him in this little kind of cramped office in the back of the house I grew up in, where he had all this research material. And what I would do for him at the age of 9 is I would be making copies of historical photographs. And this is obviously the late 70s. So it's pre-computer, pre-scanner. And
Mhm.
dad had what's called a copy stand in this little office of his crammed in there, where you have a camera mounted on an arm to keep it steady, and you take a picture of the picture because obviously the original negatives have been lost, and it's got lighting around it, and you have to make sure the lighting's even and all that good stuff. So I had learned to read a light meter and operate the camera at the age of 9, and Dad put me to work there. And obviously intellectually, I did not know all the importance of this and why we were doing it. But we just started there, and from that, I became the beast of burden. When I was in high school, I would lug my father's slide projectors. Again, this is how old I am. I'd lug his slide projectors and sometimes even the screen for him while he would, and set it all up, and he would give the presentation at these various community events. And by the time I was in, like a junior, senior in college and starting graduate school, we were doing archival research together, and we published our first article together on the Japanese American experience from San Diego. I think my senior year in college, and we would do things like go up to the branch archives at National Archives branch at Laguna Niguel and go through the naval intelligence reports because the 11th Naval District keeps their stuff up there. And again, as I got older and more conversant, and my presentation technique got better, Dad started farming out the community presentations on me. Um, and then from there, I just incorporated it into my teaching, and I've kind of kept my hand in the field ever since. Um, to my shame, I haven't done as much research since Dad died. That was kind of emotionally tough. That was our special time together. So doing
Yeah.
research was tough for a long time, but I've kind of gotten back into it. And yeah, I'm kind of the go-to guy on my campus for if there's questions about the internment specifically, and the history of the Asian American experience more generally. So yeah.
So mostly curiosity on my part. So the focus of today's conversation is on the internment, but then
hmm
do you have what other subjects or sub-subjects would you say you study on a regular basis, or is this really from the standpoint of what you've been interested in for the longest, is this your primary focus area?
Well, okay. So again, I teach at a community college, so that means as far as teaching goes, we have to do
Yeah,
everything.
right.
We're teaching lower division survey level classes. But given my own interest and given what's going on right now in our country and has been going on for, I would argue, the last 20, 25 years, um, I had already done a lot of kind of general research on immigration policy, the reaction of the United States, both politically and socially, to immigration, and and how that ties in with things like systemic racism. I do a lot with that. And so I still, that's the other, I guess, kind of broader subject matter that I keep myself abreast on.
Okay. So speaking of survey courses, we're talking about kids fresh out of high school potentially, or maybe folks returning back to school. Um, it, for the short time that I was teaching at Ohio State, I distinctly remember the moment when I realized just how old I was compared to, in my case, seniors in this one seminar when we're talking about 9/11 and the context of Osama bin Laden, his history, his family history, and I was talking about the Gulf War, which I think when I say that to you, you probably assume 1991.
Even then, so obviously I'm older older than you. People today, at least when I'm talking, have to differentiate: is it the first Gulf War or the second Gulf War? Because
Yeah,
to your generation, the Gulf War was the one after 9/11, and to my generation, we're like, okay, we're talking about the one in '89, with the invasion, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. But yeah, it's
yeah.
um,
So those moments abound as time goes on. So
yeah.
so and of course in their case they just said, "Well, you mean in '03?" And we had to go through the whole thing. I had my own significant emotional event and we moved on from there. So, at any rate, long way of saying to ask you now to kick off what we're actually talking about for someone who comes into a history 101 type course or the course in which you would touch on the
hmm
internment, for somebody who has no idea what we're talking about, no idea what this event was and continues to be in the history of many families, what was the internment or the incarceration of the Japanese? How should we refer to it, in fact? Because I've seen many different ways of referring to it. What was it, and what exactly did we do as a country at that time?
Okay, so really quick, gosh, I have to restrain my impulse to, go all academic here. Um, but one, and this is kind of a side note that goes back to my teaching days in Alabama. Um, California has an incredibly long history of anti-Asian racism, and that is not really covered by history. It's not really in the popular consciousness. So it's, that has a lot to do with it. And this helped me in Alabama because at least when I was teaching U.S. history, um, I could talk, this actually predates Jim Crow. So I could talk about how California treated the Chinese in particular, and all the horrible things they did, again, systemically, officially, through legislation. Um, and then the students in Alabama would be like, "Oh, cool. He's not just some California liberal who's bagging on the South. He's bagging on California first." And then that
Yeah.
made him more, more open to to discussion when we did discuss Jim Crow. But I mean, but that has to be said. And the other thing is, Asians in 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act, if you were an Asian immigrant, you could not become a naturalized citizen.
Right.
Since this is an issue that's coming up again, like birthright citizenship and all of that, unfortunately. Um,
Does that, sorry, real quickly.
yeah,
So the idea that we would prevent people who wanted to be naturalized will be strange to folks these days.
yeah.
Um, did so then I assume there was a distinction because you brought up birthright citizenship
Hmm.
also in the period after, and I don't remember, this is post Civil War Reconstruction, um, or in the period of Reconstruction perhaps. Then what was the distinction, if any, or were there additional rifts in the community then between American born descendants of Japanese immigrants versus the immigrants who literally could never become a citizen even if they wanted to be? Because presumably you could come to the US, not be allowed to be naturalized, but your children were automatically citizens.
Yes. So there was no rift within the Japanese American community. They saw the first generation of immigrants, again, the folks we call the Issei, as the community elders, like you would see in pretty much any community at that time. Um, but there was a rift in the wider American community, and we will see this all through the internment and the incarceration experience that that as is the case, many times when dealing with people who are considered not American, um, they there is this false connection made between race and ideology. And race, so it's just
Mhm.
because you are of a certain race, you have a certain belief. You have a certain belief system. It's a racial. It's almost like you're an insect. It's genetically encoded in you. Um,
Yep.
so there was that, and California was, and again, this is what I joke with my classes, and I think I might have joked about it with you guys. I mean, this is 20 odd years ago. I don't know if you remember this, but it's what I said. We could argue about who's like the South versus the West, who's got better weather, who's got better sports teams, who's got better food. We can argue about that. But the one thing we can't argue about is we're better racists than you guys. We are much better racist because you say the
I do
Deep
remember this
South,
actually. Yeah.
um, the first thing people think about is Jim Crow.
Hmm.
You say, the West, especially California, they think, oh, liberal paradise. But no, we have this long, long history of, again, systemic racism against Asians and other groups, and other groups. I just specialize in Asians. But we've been able to hide it. And a lot of how we've been able to hide it is some of it was done in legislation, especially against the Chinese in the early years. But a lot of it was done through these kind of unofficial agreements, or strict things that were not strictly political. And this would be things like restrictive housing covenants, where they have an addendum to a bill of sale for a property saying that if you or your heirs sell this house, you will never sell it to, well, take your pick, an Asian, a Mexican, an African American, a Jew, whatever. Um, we had segregation in the schools here. It just wasn't done as a legal thing as it was in the South. It was just school board policy that this is the school for
Hmm.
some people, this is a school for other people.
Yeah.
We had segregation in restaurants and theaters. And again, it wasn't legal, but it was an agreement between like the theater owners associations. So we have all of that as the lead up. So we've already got this big anti-Asian feeling in the West. And then after Pearl Harbor, there becomes this fear, and this fear has been there for a while because even before the war started, there was fear of like, oh, the Japanese are buying up all the farmland. Oh, the Japanese are controlling this part of the economy of California. Um, but afterwards, it becomes this fear of, oh, there might be people within the Japanese American community who have, contact with the Imperial Japanese Intelligence Network, and there's either at best funneling information to Japan, and at worst would be saboteurs. If
Mhm.
the Japanese decided to make a stab at the West Coast, and so to deal with this. There was this mass incarceration. They rounded up 120,000 people off the West Coast in various phases, and we can get into the details as we talk.
Yeah.
But we've got to remember that three-quarters of these folks were American citizens by birth. Only about a quarter of them were Japanese nationals. So, I mean, it's bad to do this to anybody because the Constitution's pretty clear that everybody gets due process, not citizens. It's everybody. And the courts have always ruled consistently that the only time you can apply citizen to the standard is if it says citizen in the Constitution, and it doesn't. It says people. So they were first put in these concentration camps in areas very close to where they had originally lived, usually in converted fairgrounds and racetracks. And then after that, they were moved to what they call the permanent concentration camps further in the interior, get them off the West Coast. And that's where many people spent a big chunk of the war. So, in a nutshell, that's the internment.
So, and is it proper, appropriate? Does it matter too much if should we refer to it as the internment? I've seen in some documents it's referred to as the internment as time goes on. And rightfully, I would say that there's folks that will refer to it as the incarceration. Some people use the term concentration camp, some people do not. Certainly, concentration camp on its own is a loaded term from the same period. What is the right way to refer to this event, let's say?
I may be the wrong guy to ask because I'm a lot more low key about that. Some people get really bent out of shape and get caught in the whole semantics of it. I'm old
Yeah,
fashioned, and the term we used when I was doing research and growing up was internment because that to us that was bad enough. It shouldn't be done. I know there's a new generation of researchers that say incarceration, and I'm like, cool. If you want to call it that, I have no problem with that. I personally have no problem if someone just refers to it as the internment. Because internment or incarceration, I know there are differences, but in the context of what happened, to me, it's the same thing. And I have no problem using the term concentration camp either, because that's the term the military used. There are military documents that refer to these as concentration camps. So I don't have a problem now. Again, obviously, as you said, it's a loaded term because of the time period. So we have to be real clear. Is this a death camp on the same level as like Dachau or Auschwitz? And the answer
right.
is obviously no. No, it is not. But it's still a concentration camp with a lot of the negative baggage that carries.
So I just want to return to something you said real quickly. So notwithstanding your point about due process, it's
Hmm.
not simply for or not merely for citizens only, but you said about three-quarters of 120,000 people. So about 90,000 of these people were American citizens,
Yes.
documented one way or the other.
Well,
In,
by birth, because remember they can't.
or well,
Yeah.
yeah, but what's the word I'm looking for? I suppose indisputably so. Certainly would have had a birth certificate or perhaps
Yes.
something like today. That's what you would be looking for,
Hmm.
and we still imprisoned them just to make sure we're clear without ever charging them with any kind of espionage, sabotage type accusation.
That is correct. Yes.
How?
Wow. Okay.
How do we, and I'm really, it's okay. Of course, that's the question of the hour, but
Yeah.
how did we justify this and what, to the extent that you can speak to this, what would the discourse have been like? Because it's very difficult to put ourselves into those people's shoes.
Right.
You already spoke to systemic racism in the air in that part of the country against Asians and Asian Americans prior to that time. But in a period where we already know about what Hitler's Germany is doing to people in Europe, how do we then get to a point where we may not be doing extermination camps, but we're putting people into concentration camps based on race? How do we get there?
Wow.
How do we justify it?
So the short
Go.
answer is justification was military necessity. That this was so there was a report done. Oh gosh, when was the first Wrangel report done? It was done before the war. It was done before Pearl Harbor. It was done by military intelligence by sorry, my bad, done by naval intelligence, done by Lieutenant Commander Kenneth D. Ringel, and he was assigned by the 11th Naval District to study the Japanese problem. And Ringel comes back with saying there is no problem. In fact, in a lovely backhanded compliment, he referred to the Nisei, that would be the American-born Japanese, the second generation, as, I quote, pathetically eager to prove their loyalty. I'm like, okay, thanks, I guess. Um,
Right?
you know, and then after Pearl Harbor, Ringel did a follow-up and said that because he was told to. It's like, hey, now in light of the Pearl Harbor getting hit, do let's do an update on this. And so he went back and did an update and said, I still think they're not a problem. Um, that and we can talk more about this, partially because the FBI has already grabbed all the dangerous ones, and I'll talk about that in a second. Um,
Okay.
and and then in case nobody's noticed, the Pacific Fleet is at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, and now we're talking about, transporting and turning, feeding, housing 120,000 people. As we're about to kick off a major war, he's like, this just doesn't make sense. But there is an unfortunate line in that report where he says there might be, and he kind of hedges here. He's like, like he says there might be a few fanatics who would be willing to commit sabotage or like strap dynamite to themselves. I think the strap dynamite to themselves was a direct quote, which totally scares people. Which on top of the very hastily done report on Pearl Harbor and the fact that they rushed to cashier, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, just this wartime hysteria said, let's lock them all up. And on top of that, you've got General John DeWitt, the chief military officer for the West Coast Defense Command, who was terrified. I mean, obviously, of a Japanese attack. I mean, we're at war, but I would argue he was more terrified of having what happened to Kimmel and Short happen to him.
Mm.
And then he had his chief of staff, Carl Bendetson. Okay, I'm going to say it. This guy was basically like the Stephen Miller to his Trump. I'm just going to go out there and say that. Ben Detson was a well-known racist and was pushing for the internment, and DeWitt wasn't great either. In fact, during congressional hearings, when they were talking early on about doing a mass incarceration, some Congress people, congressmen back then, did raise the issue of constitutionality in American citizens, and how do you differentiate who's loyal and who should be locked up, as they said. And DeWitt's famous response is, "A Jap is a Jap. There's no telling the difference between them." Um, so there's a lot of that action going on. And then there's the political side. And here's one of the grand ironies of history. The Attorney General of California at this time was Earl Warren. The Earl Warren, who will go on to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and author and or guide through the Supreme Court some of the biggest civil rights cases of the 20th century. Earl Warren was Attorney General of California and said, I want these people out of my state. I want the feds to come in and lock them all up. And then later, when he was governor of California in 44, he said, I don't want them back. You know, and then there was, economic pressure from various farm groups like the Native Sons of the Golden West, who were looking with great avarice at the potential. It's almost like Monty Python. She's got huge tracts of land. You know, it was
Yeah. We can get a huge windfall out of this, and
yeah,
it's great for the war
exactly.
effort.
In fact, one of the documents I have my students read in my modern U.S. history class is a report by an FBI agent about, Japanese farmers in San Diego specifically, because I tried to make it local for my students because we're in San Diego and I want to
Yeah.
make them engaged. And one of the things this guy says is if we lock up the Japanese, the white farmers, with the help of the federal government, will be able to take over their farms and probably do a better job farming. So there's a lot of economics built in here. So I mean, this is a multi-pronged. I mean, there is no
Yeah.
one easy answer to this, other than wartime hysteria, greed, and racism.
Yeah. Well, so and I've talked on the podcast before. I've talked about it with folks and written about the fact that the idea that General DeWitt would be, if not singularly afraid for his career, at least in part afraid for his career, would shock no military veteran anywhere ever.
Yeah.
If there's one thing a general officer is going to focus on, or an admiral, it's make is keeping themselves in position as long as possible. Um, was this, and maybe I might be getting ahead of you here, but we're talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor and a large population of Japanese descendants and Japanese immigrants on the West Coast. At the same time this debate is going on, is there then a debate? Does anybody at any time suggest, well, if we're doing this to the Japanese, should we be doing this to German Americans, Italian Americans? In theory, was there ever this fear of sabotage or disloyalty from the European front, let's say?
A little bit, but not to the same extent. So, right after Pearl Harbor, there was a series of presidential proclamations. I mean, basically executive orders. And in this case, there were three separate ones, and they each specifically targeted, especially Japanese nationals, German nationals, and Italian nationals. Especially the German nationals. Well, Japanese nationals, obviously, but the German nationals who had ties to the German American Bund, the German American Nazi party that we had.
Mm-hmm.
People tend to forget we had a Nazi party here. They
Yeah.
had a big rally in Madison Square Garden. They actually had a little town they tried to found in upstate New York. So there was not a push to let's round them all up. Just one, it was utterly impractical. We're talking about millions of people.
Mm-hmm.
And two, not to put too fine a point on it, the Japanese have what sociologists call a high degree of social visibility, which means you can pick them out of a lineup. Whereas, someone of German or Italian descent, especially after a couple generations in America, all you've got to go on is a last name.
Right.
So there was, and plus, and again, this gets into the immigration issue. There has been a constant influx of immigration from Italy and Germany, over the years. Whereas with the Japanese, both because of Japanese policy and American policy, there's really just one period of immigration, basically the 1890s to, I guess, 1907 is one cutoff date, and then the absolute hard we're totally done cutoff date would be 1924 in the National Origins Act. Um, so that's the other reason why the Japanese community, even today, you can refer to people by their generation removed from Japan because there has not been that constant influx, you know. Yeah. So that kind of made the Japanese more of a target than, the Italians and the Germans.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, well, related note because you mentioned Farewell to Manzanar, one of the
Hmm.
books that I would definitely recommend listeners and viewers read, um, when they get the chance. 1886, the Japanese government lifts a ban on immigration. So until that point, the Japan, in fact, would not allow you to leave the country to settle elsewhere.
Yeah, that was kind of even though the Meiji government had taken over from the Tokugawa shoguns before, well before this, that was kind of a holdover from the old Tokugawa policy of seclusion, where they basically shut Japan off to the outside world between like, it's 1636, 1633. I'm sorry, I haven't taught world history in a long time.
Yeah.
Sometime in the 1630s. Um,
Okay.
basically until the 1800s, almost 250 years, like Matthew Perry and um,
That's what I was trying to think. Yeah.
yeah,
Commodore Perry
Commodore Perry,
opening the,
exactly.
yep.
Um, so yeah, and then what happened is you've got this immigration from Japan to all sorts of places. And quick as a side note, the Japanese of this period and the Japanese of the early 20th century back in Japan are incredibly xenophobic. I mean, if you think America had problem with the xenophobia and racism, man, we were pikers compared to the Japanese. I mean, again, back in Japan. Um, so it was you were kind of looked askance as a Japanese person who left Japan and settled somewhere else. But because of the previous tension about Chinese immigration to California, the Californians were losing their minds over the Japanese coming in large numbers. So, because of tension, the Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's administration, uh, made a literally, it's called the Gentleman's Agreement, and it is literally a handshake deal between the American State Department and the Japanese Foreign Ministry, where it would be the Japanese that would limit immigration to the U.S. They would,
Wow.
they would not issue visas to America. And I thought, until I did some research on this, I assumed gentleman's agreement was just kind of a nickname, but there was some document somewhere, at least, some sort of diplomatic letter of understanding or something like that. Nope, there's nothing. Literally, I mean, all I find in the primary source documents are letters, it's letters between Japanese diplomats and letters between American diplomats talking about, oh, I talked to the Americans or oh, I talked to the Japanese, and this is what we've agreed to. And yeah, there's literally no documentation on this.
It is
Um,
literally a verbal agreement
it's
between two
literally a
dudes in a
verbal
room.
agreement, as far as I can tell. If anybody out there has ever found more than that, I would love to hear about it. Uh, but as far as I can tell from my research, it was literally a verbal agreement where the Japanese would not be shamed, so to speak,
Yeah.
um, by having kind of a Japanese exclusion act like they had with the Chinese. Um, Now, Japanese still, continued to come to the United States. They came illegally. A lot of them came via Mexico and Canada, um, in violation of the gentleman's agreement. Um, but I mean, there wasn't like a crackdown on them or anything to get them. Um, but there was a sizable population by the early 20th century.
So yeah, so ballpark, what was the total population of Japanese immigrants or Japanese descendants on the West Coast at the time? Well, at the attack of Pearl Harbor, let's say.
At the time,
So
well, again, it's the
September
the the the,
41,
the number that everybody seems to agree on is about 120,000, give or take,
120,000. Okay.
in change.
So we by and large agree from a research standpoint, agree that we cleared out the entire virtually 100% of the Japanese American population from the West Coast.
Yes.
It wasn't as though, okay. So to go back to, in terms of laying the groundwork for this story, you mentioned the presidential proclamations, and I don't
Hmm.
know then if you were stepping your way toward Executive Order 9066,
Yes.
what it does and does not say, which
Yes.
blew my mind when you told me this, because until yesterday I never knew that it was not as specific perhaps as you would assume.
Yes. So, again, these three presidential proclamations I mentioned came out directly after Pearl Harbor. I forget if it's like December 7th or December 8th, 1941, but really, really quickly. And then, there's obviously the declaration of war, which, constitutionally does give the president more leeway to kind of do what they have to do. Um, and tensions continue to mount, and there's a lot of pressure from the California congressional delegation and business groups and the military, or segments of the military, saying we need to get these people rounded up. They're dangerous. And so on February 19th, 1942, Roosevelt issues Executive Order number 9066. And this, most historians agree, is the most sweeping delegation of power a president has ever made. It's kind of nuts when you look at it. So basically, what 9066 does is it says the president is empowering the Secretary of War, and through the Secretary of War, his military subordinates, to first of all set up exclusion zones in the country, and it doesn't even say where. So the military can set up these exclusion zones, using military criteria, and then the military gets to decide who can and cannot be in these exclusion zones. And the military gets to make the decision about who in those if people are designated as they shouldn't be in that exclusion zone, the military has the power to arrest and detain them. Although it's put a little bit more nicely in the executive order. It says the military may provide transportation, food, housing, and other such accommodations, but it means we can put you in a camp, constitutionally. And it also says that the federal military can co-opt state and local agencies, to help them. And what many people assume is that 9066 says that this was to be done to the Japanese, and it doesn't. In fact, the scary thing about 9066 is it it says nothing. There is no criteria about who this applies to other than whoever the military deems to be a threat. And so that's the really dangerous part of 9066. I mean, obviously, the rest of it's dangerous, that they're giving all this power to the military, but the fact they didn't even define who was affected by this, it was up to the military decision at the time. As I joke with my students today, and it's not a ha-ha funny joke, obviously, more of a I can't believe this joke, but 9066 would actually be less dangerous constitutionally if they did name the Japanese and say we're going after the Japanese, because at least it would set the precedent. You've got to define who you're going after.
Mhm.
This just leaves it totally up to the discretion of the military. And to kind of jump ahead a bit, since we were talking about citizenship and how this can happen to U.S. citizens, after 9066 and the military is given this authority, the military commander of the West Coast, again, General DeWitt, starts issuing these various civilian exclusion orders, where it says, okay, if you live in this area, you need to report to the civil control station and basically register. And I can talk more about that. But in all of these civilian exclusion orders, it says this applies to all people of Japanese ancestry, both aliens and non-aliens. So we all know what an alien is.
Mhm.
So what's a non-alien? I
Right.
mean, by logical inference, that would be a citizen.
Right.
But he doesn't use, the military doesn't use the word citizen. So by military fiat, you have gone from being an American citizen to a non-alien. Um, and even though I mean, I realize, and I wonder if there's any lawyers in the room will be like, well, that's just a military proclamation that doesn't change your status legally. I would say, okay, yes, totally agree. However, it gives away the bias of the military and the
Yeah,
U.S.
words still
government.
mean things.
Yeah, exactly. It's
And
so even if legally it doesn't change it, in operation, you have been stripped of your U.S. citizenship, at least and I can give you many more examples like that where people come out and say the quiet part like that out loud.
so and this question didn't occur to me when we were talking about this before, and there was in the material you sent me there was a video, in a way I think recounting the program. It's a
Hmm.
historical video explaining how the process for registration happened. So there were steps before the military rounding people up from their homes and from their neighborhoods.
Yes.
But at any point, was there a debate then about posse comitatus, which, for folks who have done active duty military time, depending on the job, I suppose, if you spent time in the U.S. with disaster relief, whatnot, you get a crash course in things that active duty military cannot do on U.S. soil that National Guard troops, for instance, can do. Are these Was that an issue? Was that even a factor? Is it because we assume that you are an enemy threat now? It's basically moot. Like we're not
Yeah.
policing. We're treating you like an enemy combatant, essentially.
Essentially, yes. Yeah, the short answer is yes. As far as pasta comitatus, I have never read anything about if that was even raised as an issue. It was just we're going to do this.
Okay.
And again, as much research as I've done doesn't mean I've read everything,
Sure.
but I've read a lot,
Yeah.
and
Well,
and I have never seen that even mentioned as a consideration. So,
yeah, and it's strange, I suppose, the things that trigger you, but of course, this question has come up recently, and we'll get to implications in today's world where we're watching federal Customs and Border Patrol agents policing U.S. city streets, which uh, which one might argue is not constitutionally viable, because by definition they're doing things that state police perhaps should do. But we can get to that here in a minute. So 9066, probably the most striking thing to me is the fact that it is not specific to a certain nationality or a certain perceived enemy group. So then, from there, the U.S. has established a set of facilities. What do these? Where are these places?
mhm.
What's the logic, if you will, behind them? Or are these facilities intended to be temporary, permanent, and certainly for the person who's never heard of this but latches onto the term concentration camp,
Hmm.
how how should we understand how the United States, um, what's the word I'm looking for, executed this concept? How did we do this
Oh
at
boy.
the same time the Germans were doing this? What did this
So
look like?
so here's where it gets. I mean, the whole process is fascinating in a grotesque way. Um, okay, so the video you watched, right? That was for your listeners. That was Milton Eisenhower. And if you're wondering, wait, Milton Eisenhower? Yes, it's Dwight's brother. Um, it's Dwight's
What? Okay.
scholarly younger brother. But Milton Eisenhower was the first head of the War Relocation Authority. He had some real moral and constitutional problems with the whole operation because he was only on the job 90 days before he resigned. And while he was on the job, he at first tried to come up with a plan to just get the Japanese off the West Coast and to scatter them, just to not put them in camp, just scatter them. So there was no Japanese community, but scatter them throughout the central and eastern United States. And his original plan had been for there to be, 60 to 100 very, very small facilities, very local facilities where the Japanese would move to first, away from where they lived originally on the West Coast. And then from there, the government would provide them with, assistance finding work and finding housing somewhere even further into the interior. But then Eisenhower's like, man, I can't do this. And also, many of the Western governors, except for Governor Ralph Carr of Colorado, said, I don't want the Japanese. You can't, don't send those people here to my state. So Eisenhower resigned, and the next administrator, director of the War Relocation Authority was Dillon S. Meyer, and he was like, "Put him in camps. We're going to put him in camps." So you've got this change of pace in the middle, which, and you can see many of the Japanese who showed up at the camps. They showed up when the camps were still being built. And if you like, I can show you like kind of maps and stuff if you want me to
Yeah,
share
please.
my
Yeah, go
screen. Let me
ahead.
just
You should have.
here we go. Okay. So,
There we go.
sorry, this is just a bit of this is something for something else, but
Sure.
here is a map of the prohibited zone and the restricted zone that was set up by the military under the auspices of 9066. And so you've got the zone right in, right along the West Coast. That's what they call the prohibited zone, where like there's to be no Japanese Americans whatsoever. And then this so-called restricted zone where you could have Japanese Americans, but only under, military or law enforcement supervision, meaning they had to be incarcerated basically, because Manzanar falls inside of that. All of the first stage of the internment falls inside of it. So there's,
So sorry to cut you off.
no, go ahead.
So especially for listeners who aren't looking at this, encourage you to watch the video on YouTube, of course. But looking at a map of Washington State, Oregon, California, Arizona, the prohibited zone is effectively coastline, and then inland. I'm terrible at map scales. Perhaps 175, 100 miles.
More because this basically, if you're looking at the map, again, the lines aren't straight on this map and they kind of
Sure.
wiggle a bit. But in
Yeah.
general, the prohibited zone is kind of a third of the way through the state,
Yeah. Yep.
width-wise, and
Right.
then the restricted zone goes all the way, at least halfway through the width of the state, east to west.
But even in the restricted zone, at best, this
Hmm.
meant Japanese Americans inside of a camp environment,
Yes,
not allowed to live freely.
exactly. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So
Yeah.
let's see,
Keep
we
going.
got
Sorry.
that. Sorry, this is not, again, for the viewers, this is not a very good scan. I need to find a better one. But this is actually a civilian exclusion order number 5. This is what I have a picture of. But the number just designates what area. And to tell you the truth, I don't remember what area number 5 is. I use number 4 in class because, again, that's San Diego. But
Hmm.
one of the things about this is that these notices, and these were the orders that said to the all people of Japanese ancestry, including aliens and non-aliens, was that they had to come to the civil control station run by the military in that area and register themselves and their family and be given further instructions. And the further instructions were 1 week from that day, they were to show up at a local train or bus depot, them and their entire family, they were given a family registration number that they were to put on these government tags, and all of their luggage was to be labeled with these tags with these numbers, and they were to wear a tag with a number, which is sounding disturbingly familiar. And
Hmm.
they could only bring what they could carry. And of course, there were certain things they were told not to bring, like, obviously weapons of any kind and yada yada. But my point is, these notices were not sent out. It's not like they were mailed to the Japanese. They were posted for those of you who are viewing this on YouTube. They were posted just like this. They're posted on, fences and on, on walls and all over. So everybody knew the Japanese were leaving. That within a week they were going to be gone. And this is, sorry, again, this is a visual of this is the area covered by Civilian Exclusion Order number 4, again, the one I use in class. And you can see it's basically all of San Diego and a big chunk of Imperial County.
That's a
Um,
huge area.
yeah, so
I mean,
basically
that's yeah.
everybody in there had to show up to somewhere in San Diego. The people kind of down south, more towards the central part of San Diego, showed up at the Santa Fe train depot, and then some of the others showed up at smaller train depots along the way. Um, but yeah, that's what it covers. I mean, there weren't that many Japanese like out by Anza Borrego or anything. It's most people were fairly close into the city.
So
Um,
what did so you said, these notices are posted in public places.
mhm.
People knew or had a sense at least of what was happening, but what did Japanese families think was happening, or what, or did they take at face value that this was a worthwhile effort? It's hard to generalize this kind of thing, so I don't expect you to just give a blanket answer, but what what
Y-
what would a Japanese adult who's
mhm.
paying attention to the news, perhaps otherwise, have thought was going to happen?
Well, here's the thing. Um, Many of them were upset, like, hey, what's with this? Especially those who were American citizens by birth. Um, they were like, I'm an American. What's going on here? Although, you notice there's not a lot of protest at this point. There's not. It's not like today where we would have, people would refuse to go. There'd
Hmm.
be, at best, nonviolent, non-cooperation, kind of on the model of the civil rights movement. But it was a different time, and the Japanese are very, uh, again, I don't want to make an overly broad generalization here, but the Japanese are a very kind of law and order people, very dutiful, they consider themselves. And so this was seen as kind of, this is what needed to be done. You just did it. Um, and
Well, and in a way, I feel like we're also taking advantage of the quote unquote pathetic desire. How did he put it?
Oh,
This,
yeah, exactly. The pathetically eager to prove their loyalty.
yeah,
Yes,
and
yeah.
so to prove their loyalty, in some cases, did they think, however upset they would be, to surrender their property or to have to get rid of it for whatever tiny amount, perhaps they thought, well, if this is
Okay.
what it takes, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, yeah, no. That in fact, that was kind of the next thing I wanted to talk
Yeah.
about because you
Yeah.
can see here again for those of you who are watching the YouTube video,
Hmm.
um, you could only bring what you could physically carry with you. And so that means a lot of stuff got sold. And if everybody knows you are leaving, you are not going to get the best deal. And if
Right.
people really want to be cheap, they just waited till they were gone and looted, which happened a lot. And there are a few instances where white neighbors would like take care of the property, take care of the store, take care of the farm in some cases. There's one case in the Central Valley where a Caucasian neighbor of a couple of Japanese farmers took care of their farms and kept everything up and running. And when the Japanese came back, he surrendered the farms and said, I've taken care of it for you. And it's a great story of humanity.
Wow.
But unfortunately, the large majority of the Japanese lost everything that was left behind. In fact, I've got a picture later in here of here in San Diego. Um, there's the Buddhist temple, which is still actually in the same place. It's down on Market Street in San Diego, by close to downtown. And in preparation for this, the temple crated up the shrine itself and put it kind of an outbuilding in the back, and then put all the pews out in the parking lot. And people could then bring in like their furniture and fine china and stuff like that. And they just stacked it up floor to ceiling, locked to the temple, and hoped for the best. So, that was kind of a community warehouse. And then sometime in 1943, I believe, someone broke in. They backed up a truck, loaded up everything they could, and
Oh.
then to add to it, they firebombed the building to, and then we're not sure. Was it purely to hide the fact there was a break-in, or was it an
Mhm.
act of malicious vandalism? Was it both? I don't know. But long story short, everything that got left at the Buddhist temple was destroyed because of the fire. So, yeah. Um, and here I've got some pictures from the Office of War Information, and you can see in some cases the Japanese Americans dutifully showed up at bus depots and train depots and got on the bus and did as they were told. And in some cases the military came and they gave you a lift, and you can see on the photograph there on the right, this guy, he's got a rifle and a fixed bayonet, which is wow, it's just, and so this scene was repeated all up and down the West Coast. Either you showed up voluntarily, or if you lived in kind of an outlying area, the military would come and get you, and then take you to one of these depots.
So then, so this makes me think of what, and I don't know the percentage, I don't know the
Hmm.
number. What about Japanese descendants, um, or immigrants, perhaps, who were in the military at the time or in government service? And there may not have been that many in government service, but I think there were already some in uniform, at least.
Yes.
What happens to them?
Okay, so that's a good question. To tell you the truth, I am not totally sure what happened to the guys on the West Coast. Here in the continental United States, most of them, I believe, were just stood down. I don't know if they were formally discharged or anything. I do know that in Hawaii, where the Japanese Americans make up a much larger percentage of the population, and
Yeah,
by the way, in Hawaii, there was no wholesale incarceration of the Japanese. There was this segregated unit of the Hawaiian National Guard. It was the 100th Battalion, and those guys were basically confined to post and given the crap jobs, the KP, policing, policing the area, basically walking around with trash bags and picking everything up. And they
yeah,
did that until 1943, when Congress finally said, okay, we can use these guys for combat operations. And then the 100th Battalion became kind of the core cadre of this larger regimental combat team. And again, this is the age of the segregated military,
right.
where you've got all black units, you've got all white units, and you have this, at least in combat terms, so you've got this one all Japanese American, or mostly Japanese American at first, because they had white officers, a white commander. At first, a regimental combat team, infantry regiment plus, what do they call it in the military? Organic
Mhm.
artillery, medical, all of that stuff. I know there was an organic artillery component to it because my one of my great uncles was part of that. He was in the artillery there. Um,
So, but let me back up because it
yeah.
this didn't occur to me before either. So in Hawaii,
Hmm.
what happens to the Japanese Americans? So what happens to Japanese American civilians in Hawaii? Or are there not? Well, I assume there's some.
Oh no, there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot. Remember and here is an interesting bit, and I forget the guy's name, but after Kimmel and Short were cashiered in Hawaii,
Mhm.
and Hawaii was basically kind of under martial law for the most part, if not officially. There was a military governor that kind of ran things in Hawaii during the war, and he was told by the War Department, lock these people up, and he kind of blew off the War Department. He's like, oh yeah, I'll get to it. Oh yeah, I'll get to it. Oh, I'm working on it. Don't worry about it, bro. Because he realized this was like a quarter or a third of his workforce. He's like, I can't do this. And the other thing, and this is kind of jumping back in time a bit, is right after Pearl Harbor, the FBI rounded everybody up who they thought was an immediate threat, including people in Hawaii, and I forget how many. I want to say it was about 1,000 or 1,200. They just rounded them up.
Okay.
Um, because uh, before Pearl Harbor. And I believe they had started working on this about 18 months. So 1938, 1939, no, 1939 rather. Um, the FBI had already started compiling what they call the threat list, based on what they call the threat matrix. They would look at a person, like both German American, Germans, German Americans, Japanese Americans, and Italian Americans. Um, but they would categorize them on this threat list by like the position they held in the community, what organizations in the community they were part of, when was the last time they had been back to the home country, how often did they communicate with the home country, how active or how much did the organizations they were part of communicate with the home country, sort of thing. And based on that, the at least for the Japanese, pretty much everybody was put into one of three categories, A, B, and C. And if you were on the A list, the FBI spelled this out, said that if hostilities broke out with Japan, okay, not even a declared war, if hostilities broke out with Japan, everybody on the A list would be immediately arrested and detained and held incommunicado for as long as the military thought was necessary. So that would be a lot of the Issei leadership. And then below that was the B list. If you were on the B list, you were subject to basically 24-hour surveillance. Like they tapped your phone, read your mail, in some cases, staked out your house or your business or whatever. And then if at any time during the surveillance they thought you were a threat, again, immediate arrest and detention. And then pretty much everybody else was on the C list, which meant they might randomly put you under surveillance, meaning they might randomly like tap one guy's phone, and the next day they might randomly read some other guy's mail. But again, same thing. If during that observation they thought they were a threat, they would be, arrested and
Yeah.
detained. So back to your question, some of the Hawaiian Japanese were locked up by the FBI, but again, there was no wholesale incarceration where they rounded everybody up like there was on the West Coast.
Wow.
Yeah.
Um, it- so at one point, and I think this was also in the video, and then I've read
Hmm.
about this in the past, notwithstanding the Hawaiian experience,
Hmm.
there was what there was genuine fear. This is a question, but there was genuine fear and a genuine risk of Japanese invasion on the West Coast.
Well, here's the thing. Genuine fear, I mean, I suppose. Genuine risk, no. I mean, the Japanese could not have made a real strike at the West Coast. Um, it just logistically, I mean, just think about what it took just to get across the English Channel to invade Normandy.
Right.
I mean, are they really going to be able to? And even, and yeah, yes, from a modern perspective, at least, I can't see how anybody would even believe that. Now, an air raid, perhaps, that might be
Yeah.
doable, but even then would be tricky. They'd have to get their carriers really, really close in.
Because one of the threads it seemed was, I mean, it took an immense amount of effort just to get to the Hawaiian Islands and
Hmm.
execute the strike, and to the Philippine Islands and to take the
Yes.
islands that they did take in the Pacific. But it seems, I think, one of the strands, or one of the threads, if you will, is, well, if the Japanese invade U.S. soil, the lower 48,
Hmm.
then we think that these Japanese Americans will turn on us and side with their quote unquote countrymen
Yes.
against the Americans. So perhaps you could find a way to justify sabotage, but to assume the other version would be to assume that they would come the rest of the way, which even in today's map is a pretty long way,
Yeah.
and set foot on U.S. soil. And I guess I've never asked or really looked into whether that was genuinely possible at any point in the early, first year, say, of the war.
I would say no. I would say no.
Okay.
And Japanese naval planners knew it. In fact, one of the kind of that's not unacknowledged because historians acknowledge it, but one of the things that's not really talked about amongst the American public, in the public consciousness,
Yeah.
is that the Japanese military was very divided about striking Pearl Harbor. It was the Japanese army was like, oh yeah, and they had all of the kind of racist, xenophobic, uh, uh, you know, uh, feelings you would kind of expect in a fascist power. The Americans are weak, the Americans are disunited, blah 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 blah. And the Japanese Navy, and it's not like the Japanese Navy was any font of liberality either, but at least they were practical. They were like, "Are you out of your minds?" You know,
Right.
in every situation, you know, because remember they would run these simulations, these very, very elaborate war games on a map. But you know, these are the days before computer simulations. But they would run these war games based on what they knew about American strategic assets and how much fuel reserves, at least they thought we had, and yada yada. And then obviously they knew. What their own assets were, especially like the strategic petroleum reserves and things like that.
Hmm.
And pretty much all the Japanese simulations were like, "Ooh, if we do hit Pearl Harbor, the best we can give you is not even victory, chaos. We can give you chaos in the Pacific." Um, so yeah, but to get back to your point about like the fear, yes,
Hmm.
because if you read a lot, and again, I would argue it's just war hysteria tied in with racism, because there's a lot of kind of echoing General DeWitt, a Jap is a Jap. You know, these people are naturally loyal to the emperor. It's kind of in their blood, sort of thing. You can't trust them. You know, it's the traditional sneaky Asian trope. That you just don't know what's going on behind those eyes. Um, and then, that's backed up with these crazy stories that are not true. Basically every time a whale broaches off the coast of California, it's a Japanese sub. Um, they talk about, oh, if you fly over the flower fields in North County, San Diego, and if anybody knows the area, even today, it's famous for like, I mean, it looks like the Netherlands for God's sake in the springtime because there's these huge commercial flower fields.
Yeah.
But the Japanese were farming flowers up there even in the 30s and 40s, and so there was this rumor going around that if you flew over the flower fields in an airplane, the flowers had been planted in such a way that they made arrows pointing towards strategic American assets, which again was nonsense. It was absolute
They
nonsense.
made arrows. Wow.
Yeah, and
Okay.
that would appear in the newspaper, and that would just whip up more hysteria. And yeah.
So, okay, so as we think about the number of people,
Hmm.
120,000
Yes.
relocated. So we talked. I've got a couple of different questions. So George Takei, this might be as good
Hmm.
a moment as any to bring up his graphic memoir, which I still have a few pages left of, but I've read more than enough to recommend it. So for the viewers, right here, I'll put a link in the show notes. Um, he as a child, George Takei, who is Captain Sulu, for those who don't know. So if you're not a Star Trek fan, first off, maybe neither of us can be friends with you. But second, um, he will be known forever as part of the Star Trek universe. So George Takei, as a child, was interned with his family, and the first location he lands in is Arkansas.
Yes.
And I read that, I'm like, Arkansas. So this goes back, I suppose, to the assumption that they can't be close to the coast.
Yes.
But then you said at one point that Western governors, for the most part, didn't even want camps in their state. They just wanted nothing
Yeah.
to do with these
In
people.
fact, oh, speaking of, here we go. Here
Okay,
is
yeah.
So yeah. So what we have here is I call this the first phase of the internment while they were building the so-called permanent camps, and you'll notice most of them are full on within even the prohibited zone. But this is where they took the Japanese Americans when they were first incarcerated by the military, and the again for those of you watching the symbols on the map that are the little squares, little kind of orange red squares, those
Yeah.
are the War Relocation Authority. They called them assembly centers, was the euphemism. They're concentration camps. And then the little blue stars, those are either facilities run by the military, like some of you might recognize, like Fort Sill. I guess the
Yeah.
artillery school was there for years and years, or
Mhm.
Leavenworth, where the military penitentiary is.
Famous
Uh,
for a prison. Yep.
yeah. Um, but that's so like the blue stars was where a lot of the community leaders who were grabbed right after Pearl Harbor, that's where they ended up first. And then the little orange boxes, places like Parker and Pomona, Manzanar, Santa Anita, Pinedale, those places, Um, those were what they called the assembly centers. And let me see if I've got a picture here. I mean, do you have any questions about the map, Arun?
No,
Or
well, I think you're going to get to it. So I'm curious because it says phase one, but I'm curious
yeah,
then
we'll get
how
to
many
phase
of these
two.
persisted. Yeah, nope, keep going.
And so this is where they ended up going. Like this is the racetrack at Santa Anita, it's the Santa Anita Assembly Center, but they had converted the racetrack fairground, which by the way is still there. It's off Highway 210. Not the camp, obviously, but the racetrack.
Yeah, hope not. But right, this okay.
Yeah,
And
but
it's a,
it
it's a
is.
working racetrack. Like this is a
Yeah, it is disturbingly easy to turn a state fairground or a racetrack into a concentration camp.
mm,
So they were basically, they came by train from San Diego in this case, um, and they were, their luggage was checked again to make sure they didn't have any contraband. And this is some exterior shots of Santa Anita, and you can see the military was not fooling about. Um,
yeah.
you have over there on the left a guard shack, and I mean, granted, that looks like a World War One machine gun, but it's still a machine gun.
It's a machine
You
gun.
know, a black powder rifle will kill you just as dead. And then they whipped up and put a couple of different layers of barbed wire around the entire facility, and it was patrolled by armed troops. And by the way, these are, obviously these come out of, as I say on the slide, the Office of War Information, but these were not released to the public. Um, you can tell that because they've got guns, they've got weapons. Generally, as I'm sure you saw in the video with
Hmm.
Milton Eisenhower,
Yeah.
when you notice how in the stuff they send out to the public, they really downplay the military nature of the internment, the incarceration.
Yeah, it
Uh,
looks like a civil,
yeah,
it looks like an evacuation, really, like a FEMA-led thing
No, exactly.
almost.
That would be a
Yeah.
perfect analogy of at least the way they're trying to portray it. But here's you lift the curtain and here's what you've got. You've got these armed guards. Um, this is a shot, kind of an aerial shot of the front of Santa Anita, and back behind there you have all the barracks they whipped up, and I've got a close up in a second, but they're literally just a frame of 2x4s, and then the walls are stapled tar paper. They literally just staple up
Stapled
tar
tar
paper,
paper.
and they do run electricity to them, but it's basically a fancy version of running an extension cord to your Ford as a kid kind of thing.
Right, yeah.
That's about it. They have communal bathrooms, but they're pretty primitive, and they don't even have stalls. So basically. Um, yeah, one of the people my dad interviewed was actually the doctor who delivered me and my brother, Dr. Tanaka, and he was a young doctor and at the time, and he got kind of I guess drafted is the best way to put it. They didn't have enough personnel to even run the camps properly, so doctors from the community were drafted to become the health officers and doctors in the camps. And he said, man, they had a real problem with bowel obstruction, especially amongst the women, because they were too embarrassed to, go to the bathroom in front of people
Yeah.
until like their husbands and brothers were able to kind of jury rig stalls. I mean, let's face it, women, even today are a little more sensitive to that. Whereas guys, I mean, we joke about it. We can sit next to each other, be like pilot to co-pilot, and
Yeah.
um, you know,
I mean, horse troughs at baseball stadiums is still a thing. So,
yeah, no, exactly.
right.
But yeah, and I think these were about 40 by 15, I think was the measurement. I have to look up the measurements again. And they were lit by two like 40-watt bulbs, I believe, for the whole thing.
For an
Um,
entire one of these units,
yeah, sorry, yes, for
two,
entire
sorry,
one of these units, yeah.
two
Um,
40-watt bulbs.
yes, yeah. And then here's
Okay.
another shot of their luggage being inspected. Um, the two guys, white men in the suits in the foreground,
Hmm.
are FBI agents, kind of helping out with it. But let me see if I can get to here's the mess hall. Um, Again, Santa Anita is an interesting case in particular because it becomes like the 15th or 16th largest city in California almost overnight, with a final population of around 30,000. Um, and so they have to eat in shifts, even with six separate mess halls. The food, of course, is what you would expect in an institutionalized setting. Yeah. Oh, and here's a close-up shot of the barracks, and you can see there is kind of a wooden platform sort of foundation, but the rest of it literally is just a 2x4 frame and tar paper stapled up for the walls.
Yeah. I mean, you can literally see that it looks like plywood and paper
Yeah.
It almost looks like well, butcher paper just hanging.
Yeah, it's that paper they use in roofing, so it's the stuff they
Hmm.
put that heavy duty paper they put down as part of the roofing process even today. I mean, I'm sure today there's like other materials mixed in with it, but you know.
Sure. Well, and then there's also shingles and
Yeah, yeah.
insulation and all the other things you would hope for. So, and perhaps then you're getting to this also.
Hmm.
What was life like for a typical family in this environment? What are you doing as a family? What do you think is happening as you're living
Yeah,
through the
this
first
is
few
this
weeks
is
and
a
months of
really
this?
obviously a really stressful time. Um, So first of all, in many cases, the father's missing because the father's been grabbed by the FBI. We think got picked up on December 7th or December 8th, 1941, and as a, is at one of those other DOJ or justice or military facilities, and so you've got that, screwing up the family dynamic. The kids are obviously under stress, and if anybody who's ever worked with children knows that when kids are under stress and they can't process their emotions, they tend to act out, they lash out. I mean, which is perfectly natural. That's
Yep.
they don't have the tools to deal with this,
Yep.
which is bad. I mean, obviously the kids are under stress. In fact, um, one of my grandfather's younger friends, Ben was about 15 years younger than my grandpa, was about 10 or 12 when he was at Santa Anita. And he said like the scariest night of his life, which like included combat service in Korea, was his first night at Santa Anita because he had to leave his parents' billet, barracks, to go to the communal bathroom. And he said the minute he stepped out of the barracks, a spotlight hits him, and the spotlight follows him all the way to the bathroom, waits for him, and follows him all the way back. And he's freaking out because he knows not only is there a spotlight in the tower, there's a guy with a rifle
Yeah.
in the
There's
tower.
probably a bullet aimed right for
Yeah,
him.
and and everything, it's dark. All the barracks look the same, and he is
Wow.
just freaking out. And he said, it's like one of those nightmares you have where you're lost and you're trying to
Hmm.
get out of somewhere and something's chasing you, but you can't see it. And no matter how fast you walk, he says it's like that, but it's real. I was like, Jesus, Ben. Um, and then the sociologists did studies even at the time talking about the negative effect on the family structure. Uh, Partially because of all the stress everybody's under, but also in Japanese culture, it is considered very bad taste, low class, if you will, to scold your kids in public. Only low class people do
Mm,
that. Now, once you
okay.
get home, you're going to get the back of the hand.
Right.
Japanese parents have no problem disciplining their kids, as I can speak from personal experience. But you don't do it in public. That was just seen as low class. And since all
Okay.
you've got is a layer of tar paper between you and the neighbors, um, you know, uh, there was a lack of structure. There was less discipline than there should have been,
Right.
um, and so this caused problems. Oh, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Yeah, more spam. Sorry, I had to make sure it wasn't mom.
Okay. Well, yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. Speaking of which, if you need to answer that phone call,
Yeah,
answer
no,
that
that's
phone
okay.
call.
Sorry, everybody. It's my mother. Just want to make sure it's not mom. Um, but I mean, it gets to the point where later on in the war, when they're at the permanent camps further inland, I saw an FBI report that said we're actually having trouble for the first time with the Japanese community with youth gangs, with youth criminal activity that had not been a problem before. And so I'm like, yikes. But they did, and again, this wasn't, I mean, the government kind of facilitated this, but it was mostly the community tried to maintain a sense of normalcy where the community, and I noticed this was kind of the same um, progress in all the camps, no matter what. And it was first at the assembly centers and later at the camps, where they
Hmm.
would try to come up with a structure for little kids. Because one of the first things they set up was like daycare and kind of an elementary school system and found volunteer teachers. And then they kind of worked their way up the food chain, if you will, where then middle school kids, they try to restart, at least a basic middle school education and have, Boy Scouts and baseball and stuff like that as much as they could. And then high school and then even adult classes. And of course, the temples and the churches, the Japanese Christian churches and the Buddhist churches and uh,
Yeah.
that sort of thing would try to reestablish themselves. So they tried to maintain a sense of normalcy as much as they could, but while you're living this regimented life in a concentration camp, you're told when to eat, you can't leave, and I've got some other pictures here to show what it was like. Um, yeah, it was stressful, and then every so often, the camp authorities would come through and do like a snap inspection, looking for contraband, and especially what was especially frustrating to the Japanese was that they would change the definition of contraband. So things that they had been allowed before would suddenly become contraband, and they're
Right.
like, "What the hell, man?" You know?
Without prior announcement, I
Yeah,
would
without
assume.
prior announcement.
Suddenly
So
you find out this type of tool or this type of whatever is contraband now.
yeah, I mean, it got to the point where they were literally taking away grandma's knitting needles because they're afraid some 60 or 70-year-old woman's going to shank someone with a shiv made out of a
Right.
knitting needle. So
That she's had here for however many weeks or months
yeah, yeah,
that she hasn't
exactly.
done anything with. Yeah.
And of course, famously, these are kind of the lucky people right here in this picture because they at least get a building. The famous story about people staying in the horse stalls. That they literally just mucked out the horse stalls, splashed some whitewash on the walls, and then laid down a layer of tar paper on the ground and said, here's your home. After 20, 30 years of, I don't know how old Santa Anita was by this point, but a couple of decades of, horse piss and horse manure. You could, many attorneys said, man, yeah, never got that out of my head for years. Just the smell of horse piss.
Were
So,
there so that comes up in the Takei
hmm
memoir, and in fact, now that I think about it, I think his family starts out in the horse stall, in a horse stall, en route to Arkansas.
yes, because like I said, this is the first phase, and I don't know Takei's story myself, other than I know he went to Jerome, and I know, sorry, my bad, Roar,
Yeah.
and I know, but I'm guessing, did he go to Santa Anita? Does he talk about that in the book?
He
Because he was in LA,
um
right?
yeah, he was in LA,
Yeah.
goes to Roar, and then they are relocated. They are moved from Roar to, I should know this because I've just been reading it in the last few days. You would think I would retain this. Um, no, that's already when the camps are closing. Where did they go back to? I'm going to try to not burn all of our time together looking for
That's
this.
okay.
I mean, Tule Lake
Oh, he went to two. Oh, that's
or
right.
Tule. Yeah.
So funny side story. I saw George Takei's play, the one he kind of wrote and co-produced and all that
Yeah.
called Allegiance.
Yeah.
And I had not realized that Takei's dad was one of the resistors. He was one of what they call the no boys, the
Hmm.
people. Um, that was an interesting event because there was a lot of bad feeling in the community over whether or not especially later on in the war, about whether or not they should continue to cooperate with the government and especially volunteer for military service, or should they do some kind of nonviolent non-cooperation, or should they even, actively protest. And Takei's dad was one of the guys who said we shouldn't go along. And yes, I remember that now. He ended up at Tule Lake, which was one of the permanent camps, and Tule Lake started off as just another concentration camp, just, people were sent there. But then later in the war, they transferred people out of Tule Lake and put all of what they call the malcontents, the people that were protesting, they put them all together in one camp. And then so that was the War Relocation Authority did this. And then there's these FBI reports going, what the hell's going on at Tule Lake? Why is there so many problems? What the hell happened here? It's Well, what do you expect? You put all the pissed off guys together in one concentration camp. It's
Yeah. Related note. So you mentioned it briefly before, the no
mhm.
boys or the
Yes.
no nos.
hmm
Who were the no nos? Where does that come from?
So there was a very, very badly done loyalty questionnaire done in 1943. Um, where I mean there were a whole bunch of questions that about, like, your feelings about America,
Mm.
and are you loyal to Japan, yada yada yada. And the reason they're called the no boys is because of questions 27 and 28 in this loyalty questionnaire. One of them, and I don't remember the order. I'm bad with numbers, which is horrible for a historian,
I
dates.
mean, oh,
But one of them was, do you forswear all former loyalty to the Emperor of Japan? And then the other is, are you willing to serve in a combat for the U.S. military, no matter where we send you?
yep,
And again, and so again, this was done by the War Relocation Authority. And when the FBI looked at this later, they're like, my God, given the circumstances, this is the worst written questionnaire we have ever seen. You guys are idiots. Um, because, like the question that said, do you forswear any former loyalty to the emperor? Many of the Japanese saw this as a trick question because it said
yep.
former, implying you had once been loyal to to the Emperor of Japan. And so they're like, what the hell do I say? If I say yes, I do forswear my former loyalty, that means my incarceration is justified. But if I say no, that means I'm still loyal to the Emperor of Japan. Like, what the
Hmm.
hell?
It's a deliberate catch, right?
Yeah. And then the other one is, are you willing to serve in the armed forces in combat? This question went to everybody. So it went to, military age men who qualified, but it also went to, like, 70-year-old grandmothers and teenage girls, and it's kind of like, wait, what? And again, a lot of people were also just pissed off.
Right.
And so they would, even if they didn't say no outright, they would give conditional answers like yes, if my rights as an American citizen are respected, or no, unless you guys, whatever. So the FBI, after they saw the results, had to send out a whole team of agents to the camps and verbally re-question everybody who said no or gave a conditional answer, and try to figure out, okay, do they really mean it? Are they just American citizens who were pissed off, or whatever? And so Takei's dad was one of the guys who straight up said no and
Yeah.
no to these two questions.
Which is, and it's interesting. So the way it's worded, and Takei depicts that in his book, where his mother and father are debating what to do, and he says that exact thing about question 28 for swearing allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor to any foreign government, power, organization, as if I ever had any before. So no matter what I say to a yes or no question, I will be under suspicion, as if I
Yes.
wasn't already. What's interesting though, so you said the FBI looked at this and said, basically, this is terrible. This is a
Hmm.
terrible attempt at getting these people to answer these questions. So even in that period, there's people in the FBI, in the government, who have um, some amount of thought process to, I don't know a good way to say this, trying to mitigate the pain of this. I mean, so at least they're going along with the encampment, the
Hmm.
internment, but on some level they're like, okay, but you can't like ask them dumb questions. Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, and again, the FBI is not an organization well known for its civil rights record,
Well,
and
that's
J.
what's weird, right? Like,
Yeah, and
Hoover's
this
not
is
the first person I think of. Yeah.
yeah, and even J. Edgar Hoover, like J. Edgar Hoover, for God's sake, his civil rights record is wow, pretty disturbing. But here's the thing about the internment, from the FBI's perspective. Even before it started, Hoover was like, this is kind of, I don't see the point. He's like, this is a waste of effort. He kind of said what Ringel said in his report. We already got the dangerous ones.
Right.
However, J. Edgar Hoover knew how to play Congress like a harp, and some historians are like, he played this up to get funding out of Congress.
Mm.
But he, but yeah, even those agents who were not even sympathetic to the Japanese, they at least appreciated efficiency. An efficiently run operation, and they're like,
Right.
"This is not it, man. This is not it. You bunch of, what is this, amateur hour? In fact, so another fun story, and I've got another like example here on the screen in just a second.
Okay.
But at Santa Anita, there was an official who was criticized by this FBI agent, criticized that this guy was given a position inside the War Relocation Authority running Santa Anita, saying that, wait a minute, this guy's previous job was as a carnival barker whose primary attraction was the headless woman. It's like, are you giving this guy a job? Are you kidding me? So, so yeah, and let me just see if I can get to it. Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the visitor center the visitor center at Santa Anita. It is just a designated strip of barbed wire fence with a couple of barricades so people can't come all the way up to the fence and a armed guard there. But what I have on the screen in the text for those who are listening,
Mhm.
this comes from the camp administrator, Russell Armory, in April 20th, 1942. This is when they announced to the Japanese that, oh, there's a visitor center. People can come and visit you. And they said, however, quote, for the present, internees may only meet with blood relatives at the visitor center.
Who would not have been interned?
Exactly. Think about that as long as you need. And everybody pointed this out very quickly, saying, wait, everybody else is, if they're not in this camp, they're in another camp. You know what in the war? I mean, so that's the level of incompetence in some cases we're talking about.
I mean,
So this
it's
is
the
not
government,
hyperbole.
so par for the course, I guess. But
Yeah, yeah.
but you would say that this clause,
Hmm.
is this a result of, so this, you would say this is genuine incompetence versus just them trying to, well, out of malevolence, like, I'm going to get you. You can have visitors, but there's no way, like, this
Oh,
is legit, just they're that stupid.
I would say this is incompetence. Although to your
Okay.
point about malevolence, I forget who said it, but someone said once that after a certain level, incompetence has the same effect as malevolence.
Well, yeah, the outcome
Uh,
might be the same. Yeah.
but yeah, and again, here's another slide really quickly. Uh, this is the pass you had to get. So like you checked in at the guard station to go to the visitor center if you're coming from the outside, coming to visit someone in the camps. And you notice there's a specific day and a half hour window of time where you could visit, and then you had to leave. And then you see at the bottom there, and I've written it, it says permit regulations, good only for the date issued. Permit is to be returned to the U.S. military guard on leaving the area. So this specific one comes to us from Miss Clara Breed. She was the children's librarian in San Diego before the war. And she, as a young woman, had taken many of these Japanese American kids kind of under her wing and, tutored them and was friends with them. And when they were all put in the camps, she was outraged. She was quite the political activist. She wrote some pretty scathing letters to various publications and wrote a couple art. She wrote a whole book about how this was bad, and wrote to the kids and sent them things out of the Sears catalog. But anyway, as I like to tell my classes, you will look at the instructions saying you're supposed to turn it in, and then think about the fact that we still have it.
Yeah.
So Mrs. Braid was kind of like, okay, screw you. I'm going to take it with me. So God bless you, Miss Breed. Uh, yeah, but here's the other thing. Obviously, the military was kind of playing fast and loose, or not fast and loose, but not taking this as seriously as they should. That's these regulations weren't being followed to the letter. So
Yeah. I mean, if you're serious about recovering these passes, for instance, there's clearly a way you could do that.
mhm.
Um, so we talked about Tule Lake briefly.
Yes,
So a place where we're sending all of, or a large concentration of, the quote malcontents or the
right.
no-nos. So what happens in a place like Tule Lake? You touched on it, but
You
what?
you get you get outbreaks of violence and riots. You get a lot more of the protest. Pardon me. In fact, hang on a second. Let me just. Oh, there we go. There's the permanent camps. So you can see Tule Lakes up
Okay,
there
Tule. Yep.
on the Oregon California border. Um, yeah, that's where a lot of the trouble. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are problems at other camps for other reasons. A lot of tension in the community. A
Mhm.
lot of tension between obviously the camp administration and the internees, but there's a lot, pardon me, a lot of tension within the community between the no boys and the people that just that want to go along with the government's plan for
Mhm.
a variety of reasons. So again, if you take all the really upset people and put them in one camp together, you're going to have more in the way of outbreaks of violence. You're going to have more in the way of like civil disobedience and protest and that sort of thing.
Does that justify? at any point then does the US government or does the army use that as justification to say, look, see, look at how violent, look at how disloyal these people are. We were
Not on a
right. We should have
large
done this.
scale. They do it on a smaller scale. Some of those guys from Tule Lake ended up getting what they called repatriated to Japan. The military had said repatriated back to Japan, but a lot of them were Americans. They'd never been to Japan, so they just basically got shipped off. So there is some kind of retaliation on a small scale, but generally no. It was, and also I think that's kind of a tacit acknowledgement by both the military and the FBI that the War Relocation Authority was not the best run shop in town. That
Yeah.
this is just not. But kind of to an earlier question you had about, okay, we have multiple phases. This is phase two. This is the permanent camps where they sent people uh, for the bulk of the war. So for the first part of the war, they were in those assembly centers, basically all in California, Oregon, and Washington, and then they were shipped further into the interior.
Mhm.
And again, even I mean, if you've ever been to Tule Lake or driven up five, it's right off of five, kind of by Mount Shasta. Um, it's beautiful in a desolate kind of way. It's the same thing with Manzanar. You make the drive from like Southern California up to Mammoth to go skiing. Beautiful, but desolate. You're looking to the west at the Sierra Nevada mountain range. But man, if you escape from somewhere like Tule Lake or Manzanar or Poston or Gila River, you better be a
Yeah.
survivalist expert,
Oh yeah.
man, because there's nothing out there.
I mean, I'm looking at Gila River, Topaz. I'm in Utah, so I got a
Hmm.
sense of what Topaz's geography looks like. And then Heart Mountain in north central Wyoming, for those of you at
Yes.
home, not be able to see the map, you're not making it very far unless, yeah, you've got some serious skills and a little bit of luck. Um, well, and depending on the time of year too, if you're at Heart Mountain
Yeah.
in the wintertime, you're not going anywhere. So then how does this network of
Hmm.
the phase two network of permanent camps persist throughout the war, throughout the rest of the war?
Yeah, this is what lasts until 1946.
Okay.
And this is where people spend the bulk of their time. Again, they were designed to be, and even in that video, that newsreel I sent you,
Yeah.
Eisenhower talks about it. These would be the permanent camps, and much like the assembly centers, they were still in construction when many of the internees showed up. In fact, at Poston in particular, because again, that was the one the camp I studied specifically.
Mhm.
They drafted the internees into finishing the camp physically,
Right.
while their families stayed in tents in the Arizona desert. Um, yes. So again, they pushed them further and further inland. And again, here it gets a bit complicated about when we talk about people staying at the camp. Because remember, the original plan had been to get the Japanese off the West Coast and scatter the community. So there was no community. And so pretty much from the beginning of the camps, the War Relocation Authority was actually trying to get people to leave and to relocate under, government auspices, again, somewhere further in the east. Um, but by that point, the Japanese had been so traumatized that they're like, Jesus, if I stay at least in the camp, I've got my community around me.
Yeah.
If I go somewhere, what if they send me? I mean, they knew about like Mississippi, they knew about Alabama,
Right.
and the Klan and all of that, and they're like, yeah, no, no, um, uh, I'd rather stay here where at least no one's going to try and lynch me. We're so far out in the middle of nowhere, we're kind of safe, and so, okay, this is bordering on the bounds of good taste, but I'm going to say it anyway. Um, you can tell the War Relocation Authority finally learned something about Asians at the end of the war because they couldn't get people to leave even as the war was over, and even in closing the camps. So what they said in June of 1945 was, okay, when the school year ends in June of 45, it's not going to reopen in September of 46. So if you want juniors education to be even more screwed up than it already is, by all means, stay. But if you want to try to normalize juniors education, get out of the camp and get them registered somewhere.
And
So
that was it. Like, oh, okay.
yeah, and that was it. That was they kind of figured out, oh, that's a way to get at least those with kids, get them the hell out of the camp. So I'm like, okay, I guess they learned something about Asians, especially
So
that immigrant ed generation that put so much emphasis on education. I know
so
it's a
then
stereotype, but
yeah,
it's
well,
also true.
as an individual with Indian family, that's
Yeah,
not the
exactly.
stereotype's there for a reason. Yeah. Okay, so then so at the tail end, at the end of the war in the
hmm
45 to 46 period, are are okay, this is a loaded question and it's also going to sound pretty simplistic. Are we just okay with our Japanese American brothers and sisters now? Like it's over?
In a lot of ways, yes. As far as, especially as far as the government is concerned, after Japan's surrender in August of 45, it's kind of like, okay, good. Now, obviously, not everybody is. As I mentioned earlier, Earl Warren, by this point, is governor of California, and
Yeah.
he actively lobbies the government to not let them back. Um, which, side note, for those of you who study, American history and the history of the civil rights movement, when they argued Brown versus the Board of Education, Warren was not yet on the court the first time they had arguments. They actually had two sets of arguments. Um, the first a set of arguments was actually heard by Chief Justice Vinson, and the debate by the court about segregation, about desegregating and separate but equal, was so contentious that they came up with a compromise. They said, okay, the court itself drew up a kind of list of issues they wanted each side to cover and sent it back to the plaintiffs and say, we want you to re-argue this case and focus on these particular issues. And between them issuing that and the actual hearing, Chief Justice Vinson dies. And
Oh wow.
yeah, and this is during the presidential campaign, and Earl Warren is seeking the Republican nomination for president, and he's incredibly popular. In California, he had been nominated to be the governor, to be the gubernatorial candidate by the Republican Party. He had also been nominated by the Democratic Party of California, and he had been nominated by the Progressive Party of California. So basically, like Caesar by acclamation, California loved him. And,
Yeah.
and Warren had, a lot of national name recognition. So
Yeah.
Eisenhower was like, "Oh God, I don't want this guy to split the party." So he made a deal with Warren. Said, "Look, Earl, I tell you what, man, if you back me and you deliver California for me, the next Supreme Court opening is yours, baby." And Warren's like, "Wow, that's a lifetime appointment. I'm all over that action." Um, then, of course, the next Supreme Court opening is the chief. And here's the thing: Eisenhower could have, he could have basically promoted, if you will, one of the associate justices to
All
chief,
right.
and then, made Warren an associate justice. But he went ahead and made Warren, the chief justice, and he had the right conservative credentials, and he, breezed through his confirmation hearing. And at this point, the lawyers for the civil rights movement, for the NAACP, like Thurgood Marshall, they were just they were just beside themselves, like, oh my God, we're done. We're doomed. The same governor who hated the Japanese, who wanted them out of his state, and then didn't want them back, he's now the chief justice. We're dead.
Yeah.
And then Warren turns around and does Brown, a unanimous decision with one opinion saying that, that segregation is unconstitutional. So, so yeah, man, it's complicated. But back to your point again, yeah. Um, there were individual cases, and even systemic case, like there's uh, yeah, what do they call them? Not proclamations, resolutions. Sorry, I took a minute to think of the word. There's resolutions passed by various cities and various states and counties saying we don't want the Japanese back. But as far as the federal government was done, they just washed their hands of it and said, "Okay, you guys are free to go. Make the best life you
Yeah.
can."
Did anybody side note, has Earl Warren had Earl Warren ever did anybody ever ask him to reconcile these two apparently disparate positions? So to be sort of the face of Brown v. Board versus of education after having been a pretty popular racist on the
Yes.
West Coast. How do you reconcile those? How did he?
That's a good question, and I don't have an answer for you. I, I can guess, and this is more of a real. This is obviously me hypothesizing.
Yeah.
Um, that Warren uh, was first and foremost a politician. He said and did what he had to do to win. And in the West Coast, that means that be anti-Asian. But once he was in a position where they couldn't touch him, because remember, we don't just get Brown out of Warren the Warren court. We get Miranda versus Arizona. You have the right to
Hmm.
remain silent.
Miranda
You
rights.
get
Yeah.
Gideon versus Wainwright. The one that says if you can't afford a lawyer, the court's supposed to appoint one for you. Um, I don't know. Maybe there was a deeply buried seed of kind of civil rights progressivism that he felt free to indulge now that he was basically untouchable. I mean, because remember, to get removed from the Supreme Court, you've got to be impeached. The House has to bring impeachment proceedings, and then the Senate's got to convict you by a two-thirds majority,
Right.
um, which is vanishingly rare, at any time. So I just don't know, man. I just don't have an answer. That's not my specialty. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Nope, fair enough. Oh, that's a really good segue too, in terms of
Hmm.
being politically minded and doing what the base is going to want you to do. Um, so here's a question for you.
Knock yourself out.
Are you hip to doing a part two?
Absolutely. Yeah. I
Can
mean,
we
this
do a
is,
part
uh,
two?
yeah, you would have trouble shutting me up.
Well, that's the thing. I don't really want to shut you up, and there's probably certainly there's probably more to the pictures and the graphics you've been
Oh, yeah.
showing on video, but just the comment on Earl Warren, the potential that perhaps once he's in a politically relatively protected position, or what is supposed to be a nonpartisan position,
Yes.
um, he suddenly does these things that appear to liberalize our relationship with one another. And so then fast forward several decades, I still, and I want to give this the appropriate time. And, for listeners at home, um, this is a one man show. I still have a day job and I have kids to go pick up from school here shortly. And so that's why we're talking about a part two. But what I think deserves another session is, why should we care?
Yes.
Um,
Here.
and why, I mean, what do Americans in particular need to understand about this time in history? Why should we care to study the internment, um, to understand how we got into it, how we justify it? um, and then to your comment about Earl Warren, he's by far not the last politician who would have been pandering to a base.
Yeah.
And anybody who's listening to this or watching this more than likely has paid enough attention to know that we're having these debates again. In Utah, where I live, we are actively in the middle. We're watching a debate about ICE detention centers in Salt Lake City proper, and watching the governor and the mayor, who are of opposite parties, attempting to navigate a really touchy discussion with the federal government about ICE detention centers. Um,
Yeah.
and
No, no, no similarities. No modern equivalency. No.
Yeah, no, and that's and we're talking about rounding up people. We're talking about in some ways just by sight somehow identifying them as part of a particular group. Um,
Yes, and the court has given its imprimatur to that as well. They've said that race, in those rulings, they've said that these kind of race-based criteria, and I'm talking about now today, obviously not. I'm not
yeah,
talking about the internment. You're absolutely correct, which is exactly the same. And I don't know if you want to end it here, but there was the Supreme Court case in 2017 of Trump v. Hawaii,
yeah,
about the so-called Muslim travel ban to keep people from Muslim countries from coming to the United States. And it was upheld by the court as a 4-5 decision. But in it, and this can kind of maybe be our segue to the next one.
yeah,
In her dissent, Justice Sotomayor said that, wait a minute, this is the exact argument the court used in Korematsu, the exact same one. This is dangerous, And then Justice Roberts responded that, okay, wait a minute, this is totally not what we're doing at all. And he said that, Korematsu has the case Korematsu versus the
Hmm.
United States,
Yeah.
has been discredited. I forget the exact quote. I'll have to look it up, but discredited by the court of history and has no place in American jurisprudence or something like that. I have to look up the exact quote. Um, and a lot of people say, wait a minute, does that overturn the actual case, Korematsu v. United States? And legal historians are like, yeah, no, man, it doesn't, because that's what they call dicta. That's just kind of the justices editorializing, but it has, uh, basically no legal standing. It doesn't have any effect on precedent.
So
So
his way to escape precedent
yes,
without overturning the previous case.
yeah, it's basically eyewash, or yeah,
Yeah.
it's basically, oh yeah, of course Korematsu was bad, but I'm not going to overturn it. Is
Yeah.
kind of it. And plus, the issues, to be fair, the issues in Trump v. Hawaii are not the same exactly as the issues in Korematsu versus the United States. And from a legal perspective, that makes a big difference.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah,
I think that is a good segue. So I'm going to ask you to hang on here. So,
absolutely.
but for listeners, for viewers, we're going to do a part two. So this will be continued in the next week after you listen to this or view this. Really appreciate you all tuning in. Korematsu v. United States. If you're interested in some pre-reading, perhaps look that up. There's going to be plenty of resources online you can see. Um, is there anywhere? So I would ask you this at the end of part two. I was going to ask you
Hmm.
this question anyway. One place that you would send somebody who's now like, what is all this? I've never learned about this before, and they want to go down the rabbit hole, as it were.
Oh,
A
if you
place you
really
would
want to
send
go,
them.
yeah, no, if you really want to go down the rabbit hole, um, I forget the exact website, but the organization is called Densho, Densho. It may be
Mhm.
densho.org. Um, yeah, they have an
Yep.
online encyclopedia. It's got a search function. They've got, connected articles. It's basically a Wikipedia-esque website for all things Asian American. And man, they talk about everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Okay.
yeah, I
That's a
think it's
great
yeah, oh, Densho. Yeah, that's it. That's it.
denshow.org. You were right.
Yeah,
Yep.
densho.org. Yeah.
Okay, that's a great place to start. Thanks for joining us. Tune in for next week, episode 4. We will continue this conversation with history professor and department co-chair. I'll use that every time I can now.
God, no.
Matt Estes. Thank you, Matt. We'll talk to you again here soon.
Thanks for having me, Arun.